I never thought a single afternoon could unravel so much of who I thought I was. It began innocently enough, or at least I told myself it did. I had been invited to my friend's small sewing workshop, a place filled with colorful fabrics stacked like books on high shelves, the scent of cotton and polish mingling in the air. She had always been into costume design, and lately, she'd taken an unusual fascination with transformations of appearance, of identity, of presence. I laughed when she first mentioned it, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes that I ignored. When I stepped inside, the room was brighter than I expected, the sunlight spilling through the windows, glinting off spools of thread and mannequins arranged like silent sentinels. She greeted me with her usual warmth but with an unusual edge, almost as if she'd been waiting for me specifically. "I've been working on something new," she said, and I noticed the way her smile lingered just a little too long, the way her gaze seemed to measure me. "I think you'll be perfect to try it out." At first, I thought she meant a costume, perhaps a theatrical outfit. I didn't anticipate what came next. A bundle of clothes, soft, delicate, and entirely unfamiliar. Silks, lace, skirts that swayed even when the mannequin wearing them didn't move. And then came the shoes. My first instinct was to protest, to laugh, but something in her tone stopped me. It wasn't mocking. It was insistence, subtle but undeniable.
"Just try it," she said.
"I promise you'll see yourself differently." I hesitated, feeling an odd flutter in my chest, a mix of curiosity and anxiety. There was a thrill in the unknown, and something in the air hinted at change, at stepping into a version of myself I didn't know existed. When I finally agreed, it started slowly. My usual clothes were laid aside, and she handed me the first piece, a delicate blouse, lighter than air, almost trembling in my hands. I felt the fabric brush against my skin, and the world seemed to shift, the colors brighter, the air heavier, every sense magnified. By the time I stood before the full-length mirror, my reflection was unfamiliar, yet strangely compelling. I wasn't just wearing her creations. Somehow, they were beginning to wear me. The blouse hugged my shoulders in a way that made me aware of my posture, my movements, even the rhythm of my breath. She adjusted the fabric here and there, murmuring softly, and I caught myself listening, obeying, though I hadn't realized I had the choice. It was then that I noticed the stitching, tiny, precise, almost imperceptible. At first, it seemed decorative, a clever detail. But as I traced it with my fingers, I felt something deeper, almost as if each stitch held a thread of influence, binding me to this transformation. The thought unsettled me, yet I couldn't look away. There was a fascination in the unraveling, in the slow surrender to an image I didn't quite recognize but was beginning to inhabit. By the end of the afternoon, I had changed more than just my clothes. My reflection, my posture, even the way my voice sounded when I spoke, had shifted in subtle ways. She smiled at me, a knowing, almost triumphant smile, and I realized I had stepped into something irreversible, a journey that had only just begun. The evening crept in quietly, but I felt anything but quiet. After she left me alone for a few moments, I circled in front of the mirror, inspecting every detail. My reflection was undeniably different. It wasn't just the clothes or the accessories. There was a soft reshaping in the way I held myself. My shoulders seemed narrower, my movements more fluid, my gaze softer, almost questioning. I reached out to touch my face, half expecting it to feel foreign, and yet it felt like a discovery, as if I had always been here but hadn't noticed. I laughed nervously, a sound lighter and higher than usual, and it startled me. It was almost playful, teasing, like a voice I had locked away somewhere. I tried to say my usual phrases in my usual tone, but even that felt off, as if the transformation had seeped deeper than the surface. A shiver ran down my spine, not unpleasant, just unnerving. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I had crossed a line I couldn't come back from. Then came the shoes. She had chosen them with an almost cruel precision, heels, but not towering, just enough to tilt my stance, make my movements deliberate. I slipped my feet in, and suddenly every step was a negotiation between my familiar self and this emerging new form. Walking across the floor became an exercise in awareness, in learning a rhythm that wasn't mine. Each click of the heels against the polished wood echoed in my chest, a reminder that change was as physical as it was psychological. I felt my reflection staring back at me, unblinking and unyielding, and for the first time, a strange sense of vulnerability washed over me. What was I becoming? And more frighteningly, what did I want to become? The thought was disorienting, tinged with both excitement and fear. I wanted to retreat, to peel off the layers and return to what I knew, yet a deeper, more compelling curiosity held me in place. I experimented with gestures, small movements of my hands, tilting my head just slightly, arching an eyebrow. Each micro-adjustment felt like a negotiation, a conversation with myself that I hadn't known I needed. The room seemed to shrink around me, the fabrics pressing closer, the light sharpening shadows and curves. I realized, with a flicker of awe, that I was not merely trying on clothes. I was stepping into a narrative, one written by someone else, yet strangely resonating with my own hidden threads. Hours passed, though I couldn't say how many. I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror at different angles, each reflection a subtle variation, a new possibility. It wasn't frightening anymore, not entirely. It was an invitation, a challenge to explore an identity I had never acknowledged. I felt a shift, a loosening of boundaries I had always assumed were fixed. The stitching she had shown me earlier lingered in my mind, not just on the garments, but in the way I felt tethered to this transformation. By the time night fell completely, I sat on the edge of a chair, my heels clicking softly against the floor as I tried to understand what had happened to me. This wasn't just play or fashion, it was a revelation, an unsettling, thrilling reshaping of self. And deep down, beneath the fluttering nerves and curious fascination, I sensed that the unraveling had only just begun. Morning arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that makes the world feel suspended, like it's waiting for something to happen. I woke before the sun fully crested the horizon, and the first thing I did was look in the mirror. The reflection that greeted me was no longer a fleeting experiment. It had taken root. The blouse from yesterday, slightly rumpled from sleep, clung to me in ways I hadn't noticed before, and the skirt I had been coaxed into wearing hung more naturally, as though it had been made for me all along. I felt a subtle tightening in my chest, a combination of exhilaration and trepidation. I remembered the stitching, that nearly imperceptible thread that seemed to bind me to this version of myself. I couldn't explain it, but it felt alive, as if each tiny stitch had a voice, a gentle insistence that whispered when I moved, urging me to inhabit this new form fully. My fingers traced the fabric absently, almost reverently, and I realized with a jolt that I didn't want to remove it. Not yet. The thought surprised me, because I had always considered myself practical, careful, even stubborn about who I was. Yet here I was, willingly surrendering to something I couldn't fully define. I went through my morning routine with a new awareness. Every movement, washing my face, brushing my hair, felt magnified. My hair, now brushed and slightly curled in ways I hadn't dared before, framed my face differently, highlighting angles and softness I had ignored. I caught myself smiling at my own reflection, and it wasn't vanity. It was recognition, a dawning acknowledgement that there was more than one way to inhabit my own body, more than one way to exist comfortably within myself. When I stepped outside, the world seemed different too. The sunlight caught on the subtle sheen of the skirt, and the air felt sharper, more intimate, as if it were testing me. I noticed people glance briefly in my direction, and for a moment, a flush rose to my cheeks. But unlike fear, it was curiosity, an awareness that I had altered not only how I looked but how I projected myself, how others unconsciously read the energy I carried. I realized that my reflection wasn't the only thing transforming. The way I moved through the world was, too. By midday, I found myself walking back toward the workshop, drawn by a mix of obligation and anticipation. The door creaked open and she was there, eyes lighting up like she had been expecting this. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a careful scrutiny, as if she were measuring how much of me had changed and how much remained. "You wore it well," she said simply, and I felt a surge of pride laced with uncertainty. It was strange to receive a compliment that applied to my appearance, but also felt like an acknowledgement of my willingness to step beyond comfort, beyond identity, as I had known it. She gestured toward a new set of garments, this time darker, more intricate, with layers that hinted at ceremony, at ritual. "If you're ready, we can continue," she said. I hesitated, sensing the weight of choice even though I felt inexplicably compelled to continue. Each stitch, each fold of fabric, each brush of material against my skin was slowly undoing and reassembling the self I had always taken for granted. And yet, the thought of going back to my old routine, my old reflection, now felt hollow. Something had shifted irrevocably, something I didn't yet have words for. As she guided me toward the next transformation, I realized that this was no longer a simple experiment. It was a reckoning. The unraveling had deepened, threading through my mind and body alike, and I understood with both excitement and fear that the story of who I was, and who I could become, was only beginning to write itself. The next set of garments she presented to me was unlike anything I had imagined. Layers of chiffon and silk, ribbons, and delicate embroidery that seemed almost alive in the morning light. There was a weight to them, not heavy, but significant, as if each piece carried its own history, its own demand. She laid them out methodically, watching me with that same quiet intensity, and I realized that I was no longer just trying on clothes. I was entering a ritual, a process that would reshape not only my appearance but my sense of self. She helped me step into the first layer, a long, flowing skirt that brushed my ankles and shifted with each movement. As soon as it settled around me, I felt a curious tightness at my waist, like the garment was subtly guiding how I carried myself. My hands trembled slightly, and I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, my figure elongated, my posture coaxed into an elegance that felt foreign yet natural. I lifted the blouse she handed me, soft and light, and as it settled against my skin, I noticed a subtle warmth, a feeling that the fabric somehow melded with me, encouraging a new rhythm of breathing, a new way to inhabit my body. The shoes she offered this time were higher, more deliberate, designed to change the mechanics of my walk. I hesitated before slipping them on, aware that each step would be a negotiation. When I finally stood, I felt the world tilt slightly, as if the room itself recognized the shift in me. My reflections seemed to follow my movements with intent, teaching me to move with the garments rather than simply wear them. I practiced taking steps, small at first, then longer, feeling the balance in my legs, the sway in my hips. There was a strange thrill in learning how to walk anew, to inhabit this form fully. She circled me slowly, adjusting folds, smoothing fabric, and each touch sent an unexpected awareness through my body. "You're doing well," she said, almost quietly, and the words carried a weight I couldn't immediately place. Not praise exactly, but acknowledgement. It made me conscious of how much of myself I had allowed to shift already, how much I had relinquished control to something external, yet intimately connected to my own choices. As I moved, I began to notice subtler details, the way the embroidery caught the light, the soft rustle of chiffon against skin, the way my hands felt as they brushed the edges of a skirt. Each sensation was heightened, and each moment seemed to expand time. The world outside the workshop faded into background noise. Here, in this room filled with threads and sunlight, I was discovering a version of myself that had always existed in shadow. Hours passed unnoticed. I lost track of the outside world, absorbed completely in the act of becoming. There was exhilaration, yes, but also unease, an awareness that each adjustment, each layer, was binding me further into this form. I felt a tension between excitement and fear, a subtle questioning of who I was beneath the layers. And yet, when I caught my reflection, I realized that the fear was mingled with fascination. I was watching someone emerge, someone I had never fully recognized, and the experience was intoxicating. By the time we paused, I was exhausted but enlivened. My body, my mind, Even my voice seemed subtly altered, as though I had been sculpted by the garments and her hands together. She stepped back, letting me study myself in the mirror, and I understood that this was not just a change of appearance. It was a transformation that seeped into every fiber of my being, reshaping boundaries, challenging assumptions, and revealing a capacity for identity I had never allowed myself to explore. By the time evening fell, the room had taken on a quiet intensity, shadows stretching across walls lined with bolts of fabric. I had spent hours moving, adjusting, learning the subtle nuances of this new form, and I felt simultaneously exhausted and alive. My reflection in the mirror no longer startled me. It felt like a companion I was beginning to understand. There was an almost imperceptible confidence in my posture now, a rhythm in my movements that whispered I was more than the sum of the clothes I wore. Yet beneath that confidence, a tension lingered, a question of how far I could, or should, let this transformation go. She returned with a small box, neatly tied with a ribbon. Inside were accessories: delicate gloves, a slender scarf, a hairpiece with tiny beads that shimmered in the fading light. Each item carried a promise of refinement, a subtle instruction in elegance, and as I took them, I felt the pull of anticipation. I knew intuitively that these were not mere adornments. They were tools, threads in the weave of this new identity she was helping me explore. The gloves slid over my fingers smoothly, altering not just the appearance of my hands, but the way I held them. Every gesture became deliberate, a small choreography I hadn't known existed. I lifted the scarf, draping it around my neck, and the fabric settled in a way that made me aware of my shoulders, my spine, the gentle tilt of my head. It was astonishing how something so simple could evoke such awareness, how subtly these small details were reshaping the way I moved, thought, even breathed. She watched me with a careful gaze, offering small corrections here and there, a tilt of the chin, a repositioning of the skirt, but never pressuring, never rushing. Her presence was both grounding and exhilarating, a steady hand guiding me through a process that felt simultaneously intimate and profound. I began to understand that this was more than an exercise in appearance. It was a negotiation with my own sense of self, an exploration of boundaries I had long assumed were fixed. The room seemed to pulse with anticipation as I practiced walking, turning, sitting, standing. Each movement carried weight. Each gesture required attention. I became aware of the interplay between my reflection and myself, noticing the way light caressed the folds of fabric, the subtle sway of my hair, the gentle extension of my limbs. I realized that every choice, no matter how small, was part of a larger narrative, a narrative I was beginning to inhabit willingly. Yet with the thrill came unease. I caught myself hesitating before the mirror, questioning whether the person staring back at me was truly me or some reflection of someone I could only aspire to be. The thought was dizzying, yet not entirely unwelcome. There was power in surrender, in allowing someone else to guide the transformation, but there was also a fragile awareness of identity, a tension between what I had been and what I was becoming. By the time the night fully descended, I was tired in a way that transcended physical exhaustion. My mind, my body, even my emotions felt stretched, reshaped, heightened. I stood in front of the mirror, gloves on, scarf draped elegantly, hairpiece in place, and I could hardly recognize the person before me. And yet, I knew instinctively that I had always been capable of this transformation, that this version of myself had existed in shadow, waiting for the chance to emerge. She finally spoke, her voice soft, almost reverent. "You've embraced it," she said. "More than most would." I nodded, unsure whether the words were praise or observation, but I felt a surge of understanding. This was no longer a simple experiment. It was a journey, a careful unraveling and reweaving of self, and I sensed that what had begun as curiosity was evolving into something far more profound. The following morning arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. I woke to the soft light filtering through the curtains and felt an unusual calm settle over me. I lingered in bed, aware of the faint rustle of the fabrics from yesterday still clinging to my skin in memory. It was as if the garments had left an imprint, not just on my body but on the way I felt in my own skin. There was a strange intimacy in the sensation, a subtle blending of self and attire that left me both uneasy and intrigued. When I rose and moved toward the mirror, I noticed how naturally the posture and gestures I had learned yesterday had lingered, like muscle memory forged overnight. My reflection greeted me with the same elegance I had practiced, but now it felt less like an imitation and more like an intrinsic part of me. I touched my hair, traced the lines of my neck and shoulders, and realized that the transformation was no longer just external. Something deeper had shifted, an alignment between the person I had been and the version I was discovering. I dressed carefully, selecting the layers she had chosen for me yesterday, allowing the fabrics to fall and flow exactly as they had before. There was a deliberateness in every movement, a mindfulness that made ordinary actions, adjusting a sleeve, smoothing a skirt, feel ceremonial. Even simple acts like walking across the room became an exploration of balance, rhythm, and presence. I had become conscious not just of how I looked, but of how I inhabited space, how my body and mind interacted in tandem. She arrived mid-morning, and I noticed the way her eyes lingered on me longer than before. It was not judgmental, but measuring, an assessment of how thoroughly the transformation had taken hold. She brought with her a small box of additional accessories, even more intricate than the last. Delicate pins, tiny chains, and fabrics that shimmered faintly in the light. "These will help you refine it further," she said, almost in a whisper, and I felt a shiver of anticipation. As I began to incorporate the new pieces, I felt the tension between excitement and apprehension intensify. Each addition accentuated the changes already underway, amplifying the awareness of my body, the subtleties of movement, the shape of my reflection. The gloves extended to my elbows this time, shifting the angle of my arms and the grace of my hands. The hairpins lifted strands delicately, framing my face with elegance I had never imagined possible. I watched in fascination as the mirror transformed me into someone simultaneously familiar and wholly new. She guided me patiently through a series of movements, standing, sitting, walking, turning, teaching me how to inhabit each pose with intention. It was exhausting in a way I had never known, a total immersion of body and mind. But with exhaustion came clarity. I realized that the transformation was not just a surface-level change. It was a recalibration of identity, a gentle reshaping of how I perceived myself and how I allowed the world to perceive me. By midday, I began to sense something subtle but profound. The stitching she had pointed out before, the tiny threads woven throughout the garments, seemed almost alive. It was as though they responded to my movements, guiding, suggesting, urging me to fully inhabit the transformation. And though the thought was unnerving, it was also exhilarating. I could feel the boundaries of who I had been stretching, softening, allowing something new to emerge in its place. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself moving through the workshop with increasing ease, learning to flow with the garments rather than merely wear them. Every reflection, every gesture, every breath felt heightened, like living inside a delicate, intricate symphony. And yet, beneath the beauty and grace, a quiet tension remained, the lingering awareness that the unraveling of the self was ongoing, and that what I had embraced so far was only the beginning. The next day, I arrived at the workshop before she did, drawn by a strange urgency I couldn't quite explain. The room smelled faintly of lavender and fabric polish, but beneath it, there was that same tension I had begun to recognize, the feeling that change was always imminent here. I moved slowly among the mannequins, running my hands over the textures, remembering how each fold and stitch had shifted not just my appearance, but my awareness. It was mesmerizing, almost intoxicating, and I realized I had begun to crave this transformation, even as it unsettled me. When she arrived, she didn't speak immediately. She simply watched me, letting me feel the weight of her gaze, and I felt exposed yet seen in a way that was disconcerting and affirming at the same time. Finally, she gestured to a new set of garments, darker this time, more structured, yet still delicate, with intricate stitching that traced patterns like a map. "This is the next stage," she said. "It will test your understanding of yourself and how you move through the world." I nodded, a mix of apprehension and excitement coursing through me. As I stepped into the first layer, a skirt with subtle pleats, I felt the familiar tug of the fabric guiding my posture. The blouse that followed had a weight I hadn't anticipated, heavier than silk but still soft, and as it settled against me, I realized it was shaping more than just my figure. It was influencing how I thought, how I carried myself, even how I breathed. The transformation was no longer superficial. It had become a dialogue between the garments and my very identity. The shoes this time were unusual, simple at first glance, yet designed to shift my gait in ways I had never considered. With each step, I became more acutely aware of balance, of rhythm, of the subtle nuances of movement. The workshop, normally just a room of tools and textiles, felt alive, responsive, as if it existed solely to teach me how to inhabit this new self fully. I practiced walking, turning, sitting, and standing, each repetition teaching me more about the interplay between body, fabric, and reflection. She introduced new accessories, delicate ribbons and pins that seemed almost ceremonial in their precision. As I applied them, I felt a subtle tightening, a focus, a guidance that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. My reflection in the mirror shifted with each adjustment, a silent teacher showing me the contours of elegance, poise, and presence. I realized that each movement, each small detail, was part of a larger choreography, a pattern I had to learn to inhabit naturally. Hours passed in a blur of motion and observation. I became increasingly aware of how the stitching, the tiny, precise threads she had shown me, seemed to exert a quiet influence, guiding my posture, my gestures, even my thoughts. There was no coercion, only suggestion, and yet it was compelling. I felt myself unwinding, the layers of my former self loosening, while simultaneously learning a new rhythm, a new identity that felt both fragile and exhilarating. By evening, I was exhausted, but unlike before, the fatigue carried a sense of achievement. I stood before the mirror, the new ensemble fully in place, and I recognized something I hadn't before. I was not simply wearing these garments. I was inhabiting them, becoming them, and in the process, discovering a version of myself that had always existed quietly, waiting for permission to emerge. There was a thrill in that recognition, a subtle power that came from fully embracing the transformation without losing sight of who I had been. As she stepped back and studied me, I understood that the journey was far from over. The unraveling, the reshaping of identity, the negotiation between self and reflection, it was ongoing. And yet, I felt ready to continue, to see how far this transformation could carry me, how deeply I could inhabit this evolving self without fear or hesitation. By the next morning, the workshop had taken on an almost sacred quality for me. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching dust motes in the air and making the fabrics glimmer faintly. I moved among the shelves with a sense of reverence, aware of how much this place had begun to shape not only my movements, but my thoughts. I touched the fabrics lightly, letting my fingers trace the fine stitching, and I felt a strange intimacy, as if each thread carried a fragment of the transformation that was slowly embedding itself into me. She entered quietly, carrying a bundle of garments that seemed almost ceremonial in their layering. "Today," she said softly, "we go further." Her tone was measured, almost reverent, and I felt my heart beat faster, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. I understood that this stage would challenge not just my appearance, but my perception of myself, how I moved, how I carried presence and grace. It was a step deeper into a self I had never known I could become. The first piece was a bodice, fitted delicately around my torso, with embroidery that traced intricate patterns across the fabric. As she helped me adjust it, I felt the subtle pressure on my shoulders, the gentle encouragement to stand taller, breathe deeper, inhabit space with intention. Each thread seemed to guide me, shaping posture, gestures, even the cadence of my breathing. I was aware of the subtle negotiation between control and surrender, the balance of asserting self while allowing transformation. The skirt that followed was layered, flowing, and complex. As it settled around me, I felt a lightness in my movement despite the elaborate fabric. The way the layers swayed and shifted demanded careful, deliberate steps. I found myself practicing walking, pivoting, lifting my feet with precision, feeling the fabric respond to each motion. My reflection in the mirror became a teacher, showing me angles, curves, and gestures I hadn't realized existed. I studied it closely, fascinated by how the garments were reshaping not only my appearance, but the rhythm of my presence. Accessories followed, slender gloves, ribbons, and hair adornments that emphasized poise and elegance. I applied them carefully, noticing how each subtle addition influenced posture, movement, even the alignment of my shoulders and head. The mirror reflected the transformation in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. I recognized myself, yet the reflection was something new, an intricate weaving of self and attire, of identity and possibility. Hours passed as I practiced, adjusted, learned, and refined. I felt a strange exhilaration in the repetition, a meditative quality in inhabiting this new form. And yet, beneath the calm, there was tension, a quiet awareness that this was not just surface change. The stitching, the garments, the deliberate movements, they were unraveling old habits, old perceptions, quietly reshaping the core of who I thought I was. I felt both fragile and empowered, exposed yet fully present, walking the delicate line between comfort and transformation. By late afternoon, I paused before the mirror, breathing deeply, noticing the full extent of the transformation. The reflection stared back at me with a poise and presence I had never associated with myself. I felt a quiet pride, tempered by the lingering awareness of how far I had come and how much more there was to explore. And as she stepped back, silent and observing, I realized that the process was no longer about clothes or appearance. It was about discovering, embracing, and ultimately accepting a version of myself that had always existed quietly beneath the surface, waiting to emerge fully. Night fell slowly over the workshop, casting long shadows that danced across the walls and fabrics. I sat before the mirror, fully dressed in the intricate ensemble she had guided me through, and I felt a profound stillness. My body was weary, but my mind was alive with awareness. Every detail of the garments, every subtle adjustment in posture, every micro-movement of my fingers and shoulders etched into memory. I was learning, in a way I hadn't anticipated, to inhabit not just the clothes but the self they were shaping. She spoke softly from behind me, breaking the silence. Tonight, we explore presence. I turned slightly to see her watching, her eyes calm but piercing, and I felt the weight of her words. Presence, what did it truly mean? I realized it wasn't just about posture or elegance, but the confidence and awareness that radiated when one fully occupied a form, a space, an identity. And as I looked at my reflection, I saw that this was what the transformation had been leading toward, the subtle, undeniable sense of being fully seen and fully engaged in my own body. She guided me through a series of exercises, walking slowly, pausing deliberately, tilting my head just so, letting my hands float naturally at my sides. Each gesture was amplified by the garments, the stitching subtly urging me toward grace, and I became aware of how much my previous self had carried tension, rigidity, habits that now seemed foreign. The movement felt both mechanical and fluid, like learning a new language through motion. Every step, every turn, every shift of weight was a conversation between who I had been and who I was becoming. Time blurred. Hours seemed to stretch as I experimented with small expressions, practicing a tilt of the chin or a sway of the hip. The mirror became a silent coach, showing me angles and gestures I could refine, while the garments themselves responded in subtle ways, guiding my movements with quiet insistence. There was an almost hypnotic rhythm to the practice, a blending of self, attire, and reflection that left me both exhilarated and unnervingly aware of the transformation taking root inside me. As the night deepened, I began to notice subtle changes not just in how I moved, but in how I felt. There was a lightness in my chest, a confidence I hadn't experienced before, mingled with the strange vulnerability of stepping fully into a self I had once hidden or ignored. The stitching, the folds, the layers, they were no longer external influences. They had become extensions of my own awareness, helping me inhabit a presence that was powerful, delicate, and undeniably my own. By the time the workshop quieted and only the soft hum of the night remained, I understood something profound. This transformation was not an end, but a continuum. I had unraveled the rigid boundaries of who I thought I was, and in doing so, I had discovered a self that was flexible, expressive, and alive in ways I had never imagined. And yet, the most astonishing revelation was that this new self had always existed beneath the surface, waiting only for me to allow the threads to guide me into full awareness. I finally sank into the chair before the mirror, feeling the weight and beauty of the ensemble, of the presence it had coaxed from me, and I realized that the journey was nearly complete. I had been guided, shaped, and transformed, but at every step, it had been my own choices, my own willingness to engage, that allowed the emergence of this new self. And in that quiet moment, I felt the exhilarating truth. I was not lost. I was found, in the unraveling stitch and the delicate threads that wove a new identity into being. The morning after that night, the workshop felt different, almost sacred, as if it had recognized the culmination of a long, delicate process. I approached the mirror with a sense of anticipation and reverence. The reflection that greeted me was no longer merely the result of garments and guidance. It was the embodiment of a journey, a tangible expression of a self I had slowly, carefully unraveled and reassembled. I studied every detail, the way my posture now carried confidence without effort, the subtle elegance in my hands, the gentle sway of my skirt as I moved, and I felt an unfamiliar fullness of presence. She entered quietly, carrying the final elements of the transformation, a lightweight shawl, delicate pins to secure hair, and a final pair of shoes that felt almost ceremonial in their simplicity. "This is the last layer," she said, her voice calm but imbued with gravity. I understood immediately that this was not just clothing. It was a final invitation, a gentle push toward embracing the culmination of the process. My heart beat faster, a mixture of anticipation, nerves, and quiet exhilaration. As I donned the shawl, I felt a sense of completeness settle over me. It draped softly, falling exactly as it should, guiding my shoulders, my posture, my awareness. I adjusted the pins in my hair carefully, feeling the weight and balance of every strand, every curve. When I finally slipped into the shoes, I sensed a subtle alignment, a grounding, almost meditative awareness that my body, mind, and reflection were now fully integrated. I practiced walking across the floor, turning, pausing, observing myself in the mirror, and for the first time, there was no hesitation. Each movement felt natural, intrinsic, and undeniably mine. She observed silently, nodding occasionally, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and satisfaction. "You've done well," she said simply. And in those words, I felt the culmination of weeks of transformation, not just through fabrics and stitches, but through attention, awareness, and the willingness to surrender and discover. I realized that the process had been as much about patience, observation, and introspection as it had been about appearance. I took a long moment before the mirror, tracing my reflection with my eyes, feeling a quiet sense of awe. I recognized myself fully, yet I was also someone new, someone I had allowed to emerge through deliberate, careful unraveling. The stitching, the layers, the guidance, and the practice had not replaced me. They had revealed a version of myself I had long ignored, hidden beneath routines, expectations, and assumptions. I felt a profound gratitude for the experience, for the patience it demanded, and for the courage it had coaxed from me. As I moved, I noticed how my awareness had shifted completely. Every step, every gesture, every glance was deliberate but effortless. The mirror no longer merely reflected, it communicated, echoing the presence I had cultivated through months of subtle adjustments, learning, and quiet exploration. I understood, with a sense of serenity, that the transformation was complete, Not because it was imposed, but because I had embraced it fully, willingly, and with intent. Finally, she stepped back and allowed me to stand alone. I looked at myself one last time, fully attuned to the harmony of form, movement, and presence. The workshop was silent, the fabric still, the sunlight warm on my skin. And in that quiet, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of identity, not fixed, not constrained, but fully realized, fully acknowledged, fully mine. The unraveling stitch had done more than reshape my appearance. It had woven a new confidence, a new grace, a new awareness into the very core of who I was. And as I left the workshop, I carried that transformation with me in every step, every gesture, every breath, a testament to the power of patience, guidance, and the courage to embrace the unknown. The journey was over, yet the self it revealed was timeless. I had unraveled, and in that unraveling, I had found completeness.